Hallo julle en baie welkom by vandag se sessie van Agora Cafe. Julle gaan kyk na 'n sessie van professor Denis Alexander. In die inleiding van die video sal julle als oor hom sien. Ek wil net een baie belangrike ding sê. In ons gesprek tussen geloof en ongeloof het hierdie vraag weer geweldig na vore gekom, is geloof en wetenskap in konflik met mekaar? En baie van mense wat my ken sal weet, dit is regtig 'n passie van my dat ons as gelowiges en nie gelowiges regtig na mekaar sal kan luister en dat die kerk van die Here veral sal leer hoe om te dink, hoe om oordentlik te dink, verantwoordelik te dink en diep te dink oor realiteit, sodat ons geloof oordentlik kan beantwoord. Om dit te kan doen, moet ons kan luister na mainstream wetenskaplikes. Ons moet onthou dat 'n mens kry 'n paar groepe wetenskaplikes of 'n paar groepe akademici. Jy kry die linksgesinde, noem dit nou maar liberale mense wat direk aan die gehoor skryf, dan kry jy die regsgesinde Christen apologete, en albei hierdie kante, hierdie pole van mekaar is 'n voorveronderstelling, is eintlik baie sterk, en baie van hulle is baie goed met die mond, en baie glad met die mond, en goed uitstekend verkoop. Maar as ons regtig wil denkend wil wees, moet ons na die mainstream akademiese mense kan luister, die mainstream wetenskaplikes, mainstream historici. Die probleem is, hulle is nie so maklik om na te luister nie, want hulle goed is kompleks, dis diep, en hulle area van expertise is nie publieke spraak nie, is nie om toesprake te maak nie. Dit is om diep te delf in die akademie. En daarom wil ek julle, is ek baie opgewonde, dat ons na Denis Alexander gaan luister, hy is Oxford van Cambridge af, en hy praat eintlik baie lekker, maar omdat hy 'n goeie wetenskaplike is hy nie die maklikste ou om na te luister nie. Moenie net luister hoe hy goed sê nie, luister na wat hy sê. Luister dit 1 keer, 2 keer, 3 keer en dekonstrueer dit, en nie net dekonstrueer as jy skeptikus is, maar luister diep daarna. Ons het nodig om te leer om na mainstream wetenskaplikes te luister. En hier volg so ou, ons hoop regtig julle geniet hierdie volgende sessie oor die stryd tussen geloof en wetenskap.
Good morning friends. Are we all good? Great to see everybody. On that Saturday morning, thank heavens we have no rugby this morning, and it's only this afternoon. But anyhow, it's so great to see everybody. This is a collab between Kerk and Oosterlig, actually Agora of Oosterlig. And so I'm very fortunate and thankful to be part of an organization as well, not just part of Oosterlig Church, but part of Kerk as well. And Kerk is an organization that trains leaders and theologians. We do Bible schools and train business leaders and so forth and so on. Actually, anything like that sounds like science, we actually are very interested in. We're quite into the academy, but we popularize it. Stefan Joubert and Mariki, who's heading Kerk, they're both here this morning. I just asked Stefan, how does it feel to sit in the crowd for once and not do anything up front? And it's a very weird experience to him. I hope he doesn't get an epileptic fit or something during the, van onttrekkingssymptome. Maar Stefan, it's nice to have you and Mariki here as well this morning. And friends, just before we start, there's one similar event like within 2 weeks here at Oosterlig as well, that I think you just need to take note of, where Kerk and Oosterlig are also very much involved. We have the Faith and Reason Conference within 2 weeks, right here at Oosterlig. And the morning, Stefan Joubert is going to speak, is going to do the first lecture on enchanting the Bible again. Now, that's a typical theological thing, but just how to read the Bible from the perspective that a supernatural God wrote this and actually was behind the Bible. And then secondly, a very well-known theologian, Craig Keener. He's an American gentleman. He's a prolific mainstream New Testament scholar. He's probably one of the guys that read the most. You have these books are like 800 pages, and then literally 400 of those 800 pages are notes and footnotes. He just reads a whole lot. He was an atheist, very interesting story. He was an atheist, came to faith, and he wrote a commentary on just about every book of the New Testament. And as we journey in this church, we journey through Matthew, as a lot of you know, we're in the 3rd year now preaching through Matthew. Craig Keener's commentary on Matthew is one of the main commentaries that we use. So he's going to be here with his wife. He did a whole double volume book on miracles, where he does 2 things simultaneously. First of all, he just looks from a philosophical, scientific point of view at miracles. Can we expect miracles in a in a world that's sort of defined by scientific endeavor and rhetoric at least. And he's going to talk about that. And then he did some case studies worldwide where miracles just occurred, documented miracles. And he's going to share a whole lot of that with us. So the first lecture is going to be by Stefan. The second one is going to be by his wife, Medina. She comes from Kenya. And she's going to share with us what the Western church can learn from African spirituality, African Christianity, in terms of especially miracles and even the other supernatural workings like perhaps demonology and so on. And then Professor Keener is after lunch going to do 2 lectures on miracles itself. Can we expect miracles in an age like this? And then his case studies on where miracles take place at the moment in the world and what he really makes of them. So this is not going to be a charismatic hyping you up about miracles. This is an academic that really made a great study. He's a good speaker as well. And you don't have to register for that, all right? So you just show up. The 30th of this month, right here at Oosterlig. Really don't miss that. All right. So our topic for this morning is, has science killed God? And that's a very important thing to ask. At some point in this church, there wasn't a week that didn't go by where a parent didn't contact me very upset that their kid grew up in church and they went to university, they studied science or philosophy, and within a few months, their faith was gone. And a very well-known theologian in our country, Saki Spannenberg, I read a lot of his material at some point, and he told about how he lost his faith gradually. And he says, I can sum the reason for losing my faith up in one word: science. All the things that we've discovered through the centuries, and the things that we now know, you cannot really be a biblical believer in God as well as a scientist. And for this very reason, we have Dr. Denis Alexander here this morning. He's going to help us. I'm just going to read some of the things that he's known for. This is never if we just go through the resume of a speaker, it's not to blow up his image or anything like that. It's just, personally, I like to know who I'm listening to when I'm listening to someone. And Dr. Denis Alexander is the founder of the Verder Institute for Science and Religion in Cambridge. And of course, he's an emeritus fellow of St. Edmund's College at Cambridge. He's been a scientist at Cambridge for years and years, and he's most known for his groundbreaking work in molecular biology and especially genetics. So Francis Collins then as well, I suppose. Then, yeah, we haven't even spoken of it on Thursday, but I mean, of course, Francis is also very much into genetics, right? And so you're probably colleagues in some kind of way. Then Dr. Alexander is also the head of the laboratory of lymphocyte signaling and development of the Baie Institute in Cambridge, and I'm sure none of us know what that knows what that means, but I'm sure Dennis, and that helps. And then he's been involved in cancer research as well in the UK, and they helped the American University in Beirut in Lebanon to establish their first national unit of human genetics, which is very interesting. But most of all, I already had an interview with Dennis on Thursday. We did a nice Agora interview on just evolution, and a whole hour and 20 minutes. We just discussed evolution. And it's going to be great to release that as well as a part of this whole package. So this morning, we're going to speak a little bit broadly how has science killed God? And so, Dennis, it's so nice having you. He's a passionate follower of Jesus. He's part of an apologetic ministry, of a Christian ministry in the UK. You're so welcome. It's nice having you here. Let's just give Dennis a warm Pretoria welcome. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for your welcome. And I'm still adjusting back to life here where things start early in the morning. Okay, so anybody here who knows my own country, life sort of starts beginning about 9 a.m. And that's sort of pretty early. The sun is maybe just coming above the horizon. Okay, so it's great to be back in a sunny country. Lebanon is a wonderful sunny country, as was just mentioned. I lived there for quite a while. and it has 300 sunny days a year, and everything starts early. So it really makes me feel back home once again in that kind of environment. It's really great to be here and wonderful to be able to share a few thoughts with you this morning. We're going to leave plenty of time for discussion, Q&A, I think, later on. And so I want to just start by stimulating a few thoughts on this topic to get the discussion going. So, has science killed God? I want to start out by saying, actually, yes. Okay, I think science has killed a number of concepts and ideas about God that are really unhelpful. And actually, when I start out by giving the answer yes to this question that we're thinking about this morning, often my host starts looking very worried. They didn't know I was going to come out with this. But you'll see where we're going with this as we go along. But as I say, I do think that science has helped to bury certain concepts of God that certainly I don't believe in. And the first is this sort of infamous God of the gaps idea that you're probably familiar with. And this is the idea that there we have a sort of yellow kind of rectangle on the screen, and that represents all of the scientific knowledge that we currently have, which is changing all the time, which is advancing at a huge rate. And then we've got some little white circles there, and they represent all the gaps in our current scientific knowledge. And so often in the history of science, atheists have done this, Christians, other believers have done this, that what they attempted to do, they want to put God in those little white holes. They want to put God in the gaps in our knowledge, and that's the sort of God they believe in. And they say, well, science can explain all this vast territory of the kind of nature we're living in, the universe we're living in. Science does such a great job in explaining all that. But God, oh no. Now here we have some things we don't understand. The origin of life, we don't really understand very well. The origin of the genetic code, not very well understood. The origin of the first cell. All these areas of stuff we don't know yet. That's what God does. Okay, hence the classic term, God of the gaps. And I'm just happy that science buries that idea of God. It's not my idea of God at all. And of course what happens as time goes on is science advances, those little white circles get smaller and smaller, and your concept of God, understanding of God, really disappears. And so I'm happy that science sort of helps to bury that sort of understanding of God. Okay, what other sorts of gods, plural, if you like, has science helped us to bury? Well, I think the sort of concept of God as a kind of superhuman. And you get this also in the writings, actually, of some of the new atheists. And the concept of God here is that it's a sort of amplified, powerful, sort of superhuman. You get this very much in the writing of Richard Dawkins, when you read of the kind of understanding of the God that Dawkins doesn't believe in. Then this is the sort of concept you got, that somehow this God has got to be very complex. It almost sounds like a God that is part of our own universe in some way, or part of the multiverse or something, some sort of complex agency, which is very improbable, therefore, and he has all these arguments about probability and improbability and so forth. And it's kind of underlying it is this concept of a sort of superhuman God. And I just think, well, this is the sort of God that can never be the kind of ultimate reason as to how and why science itself is possible. And we'll think about that a little bit more in a moment. And I think that something that's envisaged to be encompassed by science can never explain the possibility of science, if you get that distinction. And I think that sort of superhuman being anyway certainly doesn't deserve our worship. And so I'm sort of happy that science has helped to bury that concept of God. I'm actually an atheist in respect to the kind of God that Dawkins doesn't believe in, if that makes sense. Okay, we'll come back to that point in a moment as well. And so the third type of God that I'm glad science has helped to bury is the sort of old man with a white beard and a cloud kind of God. I sometimes just wish the cartoonists had something different to portray when they're portraying, maybe they don't do that in this country, but often that's the case in my own country, in newspaper cartoons, the idea of God as a sort of heavenly Father with a white beard sitting on a cloud somewhere, all that kind of understanding. And wrapped up with that, I think, is a sort of concept of God. I have sometimes in panel discussions with people in my own country. I don't know, again, what it's like here, but somehow faith was important when people were less educated. It's a very patronizing kind of view of faith, or faith is more for poor people, not for us sort of educated people who are on the faculty of some good university, or faith is rather old-fashioned, or people used to go to church in my country. So it's all this sort of wrapping up, it's a cultural package really wrapped up with this concept of somehow belief in God is something very old and old-fashioned, and it was like nice, for people in the old days, but now we've grown up and we're more modern and we don't need that sort of idea anymore. Very patronizing sort of stance. And I think it's also good that science itself has helped to bury those sort of old concepts of God. I actually find it interesting that very often the growth of science in countries goes hand in hand with the growth of Christian faith. And you notice that actually in China. I mean, China has more people going to church in different formats in their country every Sunday than all of the people who go to church in Western Europe every Sunday. Okay, China has a big population, it's a big country, but it's very striking. I've been to China a few times, and it's very striking when you talk to Christians, many of them actually are scientists in places like Shanghai and Beijing and so forth, and they will tell you that one of the attractions to them of Christian faith is that it fits so well with science, and when they've read about the history of science, they recognize that modern science grew out of this Christian culture in a way we'll think about in just a moment, and it grew out really from Christian theology to a very large degree. And that has been one of the real attractions to them of becoming a Christian, that they feel happy about their science and their faith working together hand in hand. And so we're so glad, I'm glad that these three rather false concepts of God have been buried. Science has helped to bury them, and that's sort of to clear the decks, to start out thinking a little bit more positively then this evening. As I say, it turns out that we're all atheists with respect to some God or other, Christians as much as anything else, and after all, atheism simply means disbelief in some concept of God. As G.K. Chesterton once said, if there were no God, there would be no atheists. Okay, he was like putting things very succinctly and carefully. Okay, so I'm an atheist also with respect to that horrible god Molech, who's mentioned in the Old Testament, a really nasty piece of work. And, I just don't believe in the god Molech and so forth. It's interesting, isn't it? The early Christians were accused of being atheists because they didn't join in the religious cult of the Roman Empire. So we're all atheists, actually, in respect to some concept of God or other when you start thinking about it. And as I was saying earlier, I'm an atheist in respect to the God, small g, that Richard Dawkins doesn't believe in, right? So it's sort of, we all have metaphysical beliefs in our heads, and we're all atheists with respect to some concept of God or other. But if we ask now the question about the God of Christian faith, the God of the Bible, has science buried God, then I want to say no. And I want to give you 4 reasons for that this morning. I want to give you a theological reason. I want to give you a historical reason. I want to give you a reason from the nature of the contemporary scientific enterprise. And I also want to very briefly then give you a reason from contemporary scientists. So that's where we're going this morning. So the first reason then stems from the very understanding of who God is in Christian theology. And so in the Christian understanding of God, which of course comes from the Bible, from the biblical writers, but also through the great creeds of the church, through the great theologians down the centuries, the early church fathers, people like Augustine. We go on to Aquinas in the 13th century, to reformers like Calvin, many others down. We can sort of summarize in a way the very basic understanding of God that these great theologians help us to see, where clearly God is seen as the ultimate source, if you like, the author of all that exists. In other words, everything that exists goes on existing and has the particular properties that it does because God wills that this is the case. So we see, therefore, more the concept of the God who is the great divine mind, but behind the whole of existence. And in this view, existence refers to anything that exists. It doesn't matter if it's material or immaterial, conceptual or otherwise. It might be the laws of nature or quantum mechanics or Higgs bosons or trees or rabbits. It might be the elements of the periodic table. It really doesn't matter. If it exists, okay, whatever it exists and is not God, then must be, by definition, part of the created order within this kind of theistic understanding of who God is, this great divine personal mind behind the universe. And then, as we've got on the screen there, Augustine of Hippo, what was that, 310 AD, this wonderful commentary on Genesis just simply comments, nature is what God does, or nature is what God has done. And I think that sort of sums up this concept of the Creator God. So if somebody then goes on and asks the question, oh well, who then created God? It just shows they haven't really been paying attention. Because everybody in every discussion about philosophy or theology has to begin with some basic assumptions, some starting point. And to have a proper dialogue, it's just important to know where people are starting from. So people who are Christians start from this basic understanding of what they mean when they're referring to God. So what do scientists do then? If this is the worldview in which Christians operate, well, for a very long time, and we can go back to Aquinas in the 13th century, we can go back before Aquinas, we have his understanding of God as the primary cause, and then the secondary causes are all those mechanisms and processes and all the rest of it whereby God brings about the created order. And of course, we as scientists, therefore, in this worldview, what we do is we study the works of God. We study the secondary causes whereby things exist. That's what science is about in this particular Christian worldview. And so clearly, gaps in our present scientific knowledge are clearly irrelevant to our understanding of God as creator. Actually, sometimes I think about coming back to that sort of God of the gaps kind of understanding of God. It's a pretty sort of strange argument. I mean, some Christians use that as a kind of argument, apologetics for believing in God, that somehow God, we can't really understand the origin of life, therefore there must be a God because God did all that sort of thing. And I think, wait a minute, that's a really strange argument to have in the year 2023, when things are changing all the time, when science is advancing. We live in a 4.6 billion year old planet. And why on earth would you base your argument for the existence of God upon human ignorance? That's basically what it comes down to, that argument, if you think about it. Why should my human ignorance be some sort of argument for the existence of God? I just want to somewhat undermine that argument because I think it's such a feeble one. And I'm so glad as a scientist we've got plenty of those white holes, those gaps in gaps of scientific ignorance. Otherwise, scientists would be out of a job. I mean, our job is to fill up the gaps. That's what we're about. That's what we have a job. And I'm glad for that. And every time we fill out one gap, another appears. And, some people think we'll never fully understand scientifically everything that exists. Other people are more confident. We'll just go along and see how things go. But I'm happy that the gaps are being filled up in our scientific knowledge. So the second reason why science hasn't buried the God of Christian faith, apart from that theological one that we just talked about, it's sort of closely connected to the theology, but it's a distinctive point here. And that's this very obvious fact that as far as European history is concerned, modern science was started by Christians. So we started it. So, I mean, a scientific community is the most natural place for a Christian to be. I mean, if you live in a country that invented rugby, maybe, I better not go there, but, it's a very natural thing to play rugby in a country that invents rugby or invents football or whatever it is. It's a natural place to be. And so in a similar kind of way, the scientific community is the most normal, natural place for a Christian to be. That's where we belong, because we started it. And you can easily show that as you go back and look at the history of science. So if you go back to the 17th century, put up a bunch of names there, all the people on the screen, those wonderful people in the different fields, as we now call them, disciplines, but in the days of the early emergence of modern science, of course, they were natural philosophers. They didn't see any separation between science and faith because they were simply united under this great one overarching kind of concept of natural philosophy. And there we have people such as Robert Boyle, one of the founders of modern chemistry, a very deeply committed Christian. We have people such as the astronomers Kepler and Galileo. We've got naturalists such as John Ray from Cambridge, Linnaeus, natural philosophers working in the physical sciences, people, of course, like Isaac Newton, Michael Faraday, after whom we named our institute in Cambridge, 19th century physicist, without whom we wouldn't have the lights on this morning, the person who first found out how to generate electricity by using a little mini kind of generator and so forth. We've got people like James Clerk Maxwell, again a 19th century Christian and so forth. And everywhere you look in the history of science, you see these deeply committed Christian believers who were really motivated so wonderfully by their own Christian faith. And so some people say, well, people would have done science anyway. But honestly, if you look around where science is developed in the world, what you discover is, first of all, you need a motivation to be curious about how the world works. Without that deep sense of curiosity, you don't even bother to get started. And, it would be not fair to mention countries, but you can go to certain parts of the world where that curiosity traditionally has been lacking. They've now imported science from elsewhere and so forth. But if that intrinsic curiosity is lacking, science never gets off the ground. And one great thing about this very passionate belief in the great Creator God is that He gives motivation to explore His world. It's His world, it's God's world. Everything we discover is part of God's world, and that is part of the great motivation. And that's part of the great motivation of how the Royal Society, that is the London-based Royal Society, was founded in the middle part of the 16th century. And it was really founded almost like a Christian mission, actually, you could say, by those early Christian natural philosophers. And so the 1663 Charter of the Royal Society declares that its activities shall be devoted to the glory of God the Creator and the advantage of the human race. Its officers were required to swear an oath on the holy gospels of God. It's a very, very strongly Christian, it was a Christian mission to explore the world and to give glory to God through what was discovered. And so Bishop Thomas Spratt was the Society's first historian, and he noted that the experimental study of nature was really a form of Christian worship. Now, that wasn't true of every single fellow of the Royal Society, but it was true very much of the early founders. Bishop Wilkins was another person. We can mention many other names, though. So we're not talking, as I say, mostly about sort of nominal Christians who just made a nod towards religion because that somehow socially validated their discoveries or something like that. We're talking about people who really at their heart had Christian faith very centrally in their lives and made a big difference to them and so forth. And many of them wrote about how their faith motivated their science. As you probably know, we've one of the key founders of modern astronomy was Johannes Kepler, and he wrote that I had the intention of becoming a theologian, but now I see how God is by my endeavors also glorified in astronomy, for the heavens declare the glory of God. Another place he writes, astronomers are the priests of God, calling to interpret the book of nature. So, I mean, maybe they're a little bit sort of highfalutin, but they almost saw themselves, these Christian natural philosophers, as a kind of new form of priesthood, because they were the ones who were really going to help people to understand the works of God in the created order. And then we have Robert Boyle, as I mentioned, one of the founders of modern chemistry, famously writing that as the two great books of nature and of scripture have the same author, so the study of the latter does not at all hinder an inquisitive man's delight in the study of the former. And Boyle is an interesting character, actually. He tried learning Hebrew and Greek and Chaldean and Syriac in order to study the Bible in the original languages. He apparently didn't get very far in some of the languages, according to his colleagues, but that was his aim. He really wanted to study the Bible more systematically, and that's why he did that in his spare time. Meanwhile, you remember Boyle's law of gases, you probably did at school. It's still with us, isn't it, to the present day, and did some wonderful experiments and so forth, really got empirical science, helped to get that off the ground and so forth. A really interesting character. But as I say, if you'd asked these natural philosophers, if you'd gone up to Sir Isaac Newton at Trinity College, Cambridge, just around the road from where I live, and I cycle past there every day, I sometimes think about that. You can still see his room there if you go to visit the college. And if you'd asked Sir Isaac Newton, so Professor Newton, what's the difference between, how do you relate science and religion? He would have looked to you and go, what do you mean? I don't understand what you're talking about. Because for those natural philosophers, as I say, there wasn't something called science and something called religion, as if they were in separate compartments. I mean, these were all part of natural philosophy. And as we'll think about in a moment, people like Newton did as much Bible study as he did discovering, laws of gravity and things like that. Just to flip over to the 19th century, I have to tell you this example. Again, it's from Cambridge. If you cycle around Cambridge, in some ways you're cycling around a good slice of the history of science. But if you cycle along to this particular picture, I was there just the other day. This is the old Cavendish Physics Laboratory at Cambridge. It's now moved to a huge new laboratory. But it was founded by James Clerk Maxwell, and he was a deeply committed Christian. And when he founded the laboratory, which has now had about 30 Nobel Prize winners since his time, he had this verse from the Psalms, put above the gateway, which you can still see in Latin there. I won't try and do my Latin there, but when they moved the laboratory to the great new Cavendish laboratory on the edge of Cambridge, he also moved the verse with them, if you like, the Bible verse, put it in English this time, the works of the Lord are great, sought out of all them that have pleasure therein. And so every single physicist in Cambridge to the present day, whether they believe in God or not, but if they look up as they go into their huge, great new building, it's a very nice building, full of nice labs, that's the verse they see. And if they want to be reminded, they are reminded of the fact that the roots of what they're doing in science are very much in Christian theology. And indeed, no historian of science today takes the idea of conflict between science and religion seriously as an overarching model to describe the historical relationship between science and religion. We have here a historian of science, well-known one, American Stephen Shapin, and these are words written way back in 1996, a long time ago now. But in his book, The Scientific Revolution, he says in the late Victorian period, it was common to write about the warfare between science and religion and to presume that these two bodies of culture must always have been in conflict. However, it has been a very long time since these attitudes have been held by historians of science. And that's why if you read atheists like Richard Dawkins, you'll find they keep, usually if they're sensible, they keep pretty quiet. If they want to defend their atheism, they don't go to history, okay, because they know a little bit of this history anyway, and so they keep quiet about it. So given that fact, I think it's quite interesting to track the historical reasons why some scientists and others today do think that science in some way has killed God. And I just want to spend a little bit of time on this because it's kind of a sort of interest in the history of ideas, really, about where these sort of ideas come from. And there are different streams in this idea, but one stream I want to comment on is this one that comes from the 19th century French philosopher Auguste Comte. And according to Comte, each branch of knowledge passes successively through these three different kind of theoretical conditions. He talked about them as, first of all, the theological or fictitious, and then the metaphysical or abstract, and then finally this leads on to the scientific, or what he called the positive. And so that sort of understanding became pretty popular in certain academic parts of the world in the 19th century, and because according to Comte, all real knowledge will eventually become scientific knowledge, and that's going to take some time, but this is kind of an inevitable process, that's happening already and will happen more. And so I think the ghost of Comte sort of lives on today in the idea that first you have sort of superstitious religious ideas, and then these are gradually replaced by science until in the end there is no need for religion anymore. And that's a sort of common popular trope, common popular idea that comes through to us and often is found in the scientific community. In fact, Comte sought to make science into a kind of religion of humanity, complete with places of worship, that is worship to humanity, not to God. And then he had 9 personal secular sacraments. He had no less than 81 annual festivals. I thought, wow, that's a great religion. Basically built around holidays, 81. By the way, we used to have that in Lebanon, not 81, but of course Lebanon is a very multi-religious society, which can lead to some problems. And so we celebrated all the Muslim festivals, we celebrated those, all the Druze festivals, all the Christian festivals. So it was pretty good, really. We didn't ever get up to 81, but this religion had 81 anyway. But it didn't last for very long. And when you think about it, it's pretty obvious it's not going to last because trying to worship humanity is really not a very good start for a religion. Humanity is simply not transcendent enough, to put it mildly, to be an object of worship. And so if you go around places like Brazil, there's a picture there of one of these positivist temples. That's what they were called, positivist temples. There's a derelict one in Porto Alegre, Brazil, and you can find others if you travel around the world, and you can see how a religion can be born and how it can die. Anyway, just to carry on our story about the sort of history of ideas, as you well know, anyone who's done little philosophy will know about the Vienna Circle in the 1920s, 1930s. There were this group of philosophers in Vienna who came to be known as the Vienna Circle, and they took Comte's philosophy a whole stage further. And these are the folk then called, they came to be called logical positivists. And so they defined meaning and rationality itself according to whether it was empirically verifiable. In other words, whether it could be shown to be true by a scientific experiment. So they took the example and said, well, if you put white light through a prism, then you have colors coming out the other side, and so that means something. That actually is a claim that has meaning because it can be verified experimentally by anybody in the world. You can actually take some white light and shine it through the prism, and there you have the colors. But then they went on to say, well, if you make a claim like God is love, that doesn't mean anything because you've got no way of scientifically verifying or falsifying that particular concept. And then they claimed that according to them, that proposition was therefore meaningless because it couldn't be verified from a scientific perspective. When I was at Oxford back a few years ago, well, in the mid-1960s to be precise, we had this philosopher, A.J. Ayer, and in his book, Language, Truth and Logic, which was originally written in 1936. He published it at the age of 26, a very influential book. He made some very significant revisions to the book in 1946. But there he declares that, and I quote, "There is no logical ground for antagonism between religion and natural science, for since the religious utterances of the theist are not genuine propositions at all, they cannot stand in any logical relation to the propositions of science," close quote. And originally, earlier on in his life, Ayer also rejected atheism on the same grounds, since it involves talk about religion, and that's just meaningless, and so forth. Therefore, we can't really have a rational conversation about it at all. Now, when I was a student in Oxford, he was still professor of logic and remained very influential at that time. But later on in his life, it's quite interesting actually tracking through what happens in philosophers' lives. In this particular case, he rejected really most of what he'd written earlier on in his life. Because it was recognized, and he recognized as well eventually, that here we have a kind of classical case of soaring off the branch on which you're sitting, which can happen in philosophy. And so his philosophy died through the realization it could not itself be verified using its own principles of scientific verification. And there were various efforts to reformulate the philosophy and to try and save the day, try and save the branch. But A.J. Ayer himself was forced to admit to an interviewer in later life about his positivism that nearly all of it was false, and in detail, very little survived. It's sort of quite a sad story in some ways, that he spent his whole life invested heavily in his philosophy, which in the end ended up killing itself. It got buried, self-buried by its own philosophy. Now, logical positivism as a serious philosophy was dead a long time ago in departments of philosophy. But what's, I think, interesting is it's left a kind of residue, which today we call scientism, which is a kind of first cousin of logical positivism. And scientism is, I call the sort of the ghost of positivism. It's still making the same claim, or it's the same assumption, and you find it a lot in the scientific community. And that assumption is that really scientific information and knowledge is the only reliable form of knowledge, and it's the only knowledge worth bothering about. And so let's forget about all the other forms of knowing and so forth. And so we can sort of see the history of ideas, I think, very much coming down from Auguste Comte in this particular case. Okay, so that's just a little bit about that second point. I'll give you a brief overview to get a discussion going. But I want to go on now to the third reason why we know science hasn't buried God, and that's because of the assumptions and practices of contemporary science. Now, those assumptions didn't just appear from anywhere. I mean, as we've already been thinking, they had deep theological roots, many of them. This motivation to explore the universe we've already talked about, but also the rationality and intelligibility of the universe, which is therefore amenable to scientific explanation because created by a rational God. That's got deep theological roots. Also the fact there must be scientific laws whereby God rules over the universe, somehow comparable with God's moral laws. That also has deep theological roots. And then empiricism, the actual idea of doing experiments, that itself also had some very deep theological roots. And we could spend a whole hour, which we will not, to your relief, looking at that in some detail, just thinking about the theological roots of each of those assumptions that scientists make in their daily life in a lab. But if we just go back and think about one or two of those claims I've just made there, just to support them historically, again, going back to Isaac Newton for a moment and his great book, perhaps the most famous book in the whole history of science, is the Principia Mathematica, 1687, where he writes that the most beautiful system of the sun, the planets and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. So the point is here that science really can't explain itself. Okay? In science, you just have to start out with a whole set of assumptions about the way the world works, the fact that things are reproducible, the fact that there's a logic, there's a rationality underlying the whole of mathematics. You just have to accept that by faith, if you like. Now, of course, we've been doing centuries and centuries of science, so people just don't even think about it because they just start out with those assumptions. But if you stand back and think about it a little bit, you realize that science, the scientific enterprise itself, cannot explain itself without really these deep understanding of deep theological roots. You need faith that the universe is comprehensible, that it's coherent, that we have the potential to understand it. Einstein, I'm sure you've seen that quote before, but I'll flag it up here because it's relevant to this discussion, where Albert Einstein said that the most incomprehensible thing about the world is that it is comprehensible. It's a very profound statement when you really start thinking about that. And as I say, if we just think about our scientific laws, they clearly have deep theological roots. You see this particularly in the writings of René Descartes, in the writings of Robert Boyle again, the writings of Isaac Newton. And so the idea was that just as there is a creator God who establishes moral laws for the universe, so there must be scientific laws that describe God's rational, mathematical activity in his creation. And these laws can be discovered only empirically. They can't be worked out from the first principles, as some of the Greek rationalists were mistakenly thinking in earlier days. So here we have Robert Boyle again. The laws of motion, without which the present state and course of things could not be maintained, did not necessarily spring from the nature of matter, but depended upon the will of the divine author of all things. And that recognition, actually, that scientific laws have deep theological roots has led some people, some philosophers, to even want to move away from the idea of scientific laws altogether, partly because they recognize that this is deeply rooted in this theology, and they don't like the theology, so they want to get away from the concept of scientific laws. But anyway, that's another story. But there's also, as I mentioned, good historical grounds for the view that Christian theism did much to nurture this understanding of empiricism, of doing experiments. And again, this is not a quote directly from Isaac Newton, but from Coates, who wrote the preface to the second edition of his great Principia Mathematica. And these were words clearly approved by Newton himself. He was pretty fussy about who wrote his preface, the preface for his book. Anyway, he wrote, "Without all doubt, this world could arise from nothing but the perfectly free will of God. These laws of nature, therefore, we must not seek from uncertain conjectures, but learn them from observations and experiments." Now again, it's sort of so much part of scientific culture to do experiments. We just take that for granted, we don't think about it much, but this was really revolutionary in the 17th century. The fact you really had to torture nature. Francis Bacon put it in these rather strong words, but you have to really work hard to see how things work, and you have to do those experiments to find out how things work. So a very powerful point. So coming back to the present day, if somebody thinks that science is the only source of reliable knowledge, which I say is really a philosophy known as scientism today, I think they have some real problems in trying to explain why the scientific enterprise itself is even possible. But once we adopt the worldview of those early natural philosophers, that there is a personal, rational, creator God, a great mind behind the universe, who's brought all things into being, whose faithfulness is displayed in the reproducibility of the properties of matter, then I think we can see how the scientific enterprise itself has a very solid foundation, a very strong validation. We might agree, of course, that, okay, the history looks good, and, that all sounds very well, but isn't it now the case that we can sort of simply accept the gift, if you like, of science that theology has given to us, and we kind of throw away the old wrapping paper, and we can just live with the science and forget about all this theology. So again, hasn't science removed the need for God as its explanations have become ever more complete? Well, I want to say this morning, in answer to that rhetorical question, not really. And I want to suggest that it reflects a rather simplistic understanding of knowledge and where different forms of knowledge come from. And I want to just give you a little simple model here about how we relate sort of different forms of knowledge and how that relates to the question we were just thinking about. So let's imagine that the whole of this book of life we can sort of summarize in this great rectangle with lots of different levels in this rectangle. And each level pictured here represents one particular way of understanding the world, one particular type of knowledge that we gain from our study of the world, if you like. And of course we have a level which is scientific. I don't put it at the top because it's more important. I have to put it somewhere. But clearly the scientific type of knowledge refers to the mechanisms involved in the way the world works, how the energies, how the mathematical structure of the world works, etc., etc. All this, all the kind of stuff that we publish in scientific papers. But then we have another level, don't we? We have the ethical level, in answer to the question, what ought we to do with all this wonderful new information, these new discoveries, how ought we to apply them? It's a whole level of discourse which has its own discipline and so forth. And then we have another level which we can call the aesthetic. What do we count as beauty in the world? How do we judge the beauty of poetry or films or drama or whatever it might be? It's a whole different form of discourse, but one which is incredibly valuable and very central to many of our lives. And even more central is level 4 there, the personal understanding of the world, our own personal biographies, our own personal knowledge and experience of the world, which is clearly the most important for us. That's not scientific knowledge. It's knowledge which is unique to us. It's a unique set of experiences of the world. And then we have the, if you like, the religious, philosophical questions, the great questions we've been thinking about this morning. Why is there a universe anyway? What breathes fire into the equations? The late Stephen Hawking liked to ask that sort of question. Does life have any purpose in an ultimate sense? How ought I to live my life? Does God exist? These are the great big questions of life, the big questions. And of course the point about putting up this sort of model is simply to state the obvious, that these are all parallel, they're all complementary types of knowledge. There are many ways of knowing, and there's no need to put them into any kind of conflict with each other. They might be in some occasions, but there's no need for that. And in one sense, they're all part of this great one reality, and I don't want to compartmentalize different disciplines too much. We're going to put some arrows in there to remind us this is all part of one great reality. But the fact is, I mean, none of us have brains big enough for the sort of Herculean task of encompassing the whole of reality all at the same time. And so in a way, this model simply reflects the structure of our universities. We have different departments, different faculties. The people down the road there in the faculty of law have their own particular way of justifying their beliefs. Go to history, that's a little bit different. Go to psychology, a bit different. Go to my field of biochemistry, it's a little bit different. And so we all justify our beliefs in slightly different ways, but they're all valid forms of knowledge, otherwise there's no point in having a university, is there? And so in a way this reflects this basic fact that there are many different ways of knowing, and we make a mistake if we think that there's only one way. And this mistake, unfortunately, has been made by a number of scientists. I just want to give you an example here from the late Francis Crick, who of course became famous through his co-discovery of the structure of DNA, the famous double helix. And here he's writing in his book, The Astonishing Hypothesis, running from an atheistic perspective, that the astonishing hypothesis is that you, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will, are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. And so always be suspicious, I would say, if you see that little phrase, no more than or nothing but. It's sometimes called nothing buttery, okay, for that reason, that somehow what Crick is saying is, once you've got my level of understanding of the brain, there's really no more to say. That's the only one that counts, okay? And so clearly that's not the case. There are many, many ways we can, perspectives we can look at the brain, but more formally, nothing buttery is called ontological reductionism. The idea that once the components of an entity have been described, that's all there is. Methodological reductionism, of course, is something quite different. That's what we use in science all the time, successfully. If you want to know how something works, take it to bits. You do the same if you're a car mechanic. You do the same if you're a biochemist. Absolutely fine. Ontological reductionism is that step further, which leads you into scientism and leads you into this philosophy that tries to claim this is the only knowledge that counts. So finally, I just want to reflect on the fourth reason why science hasn't buried God, and that's simply the fact that there are so many scientists in the research community. And it's quite striking, in fact. I don't know what it's like in this country. If I go to Cambridge, if you want to find Christians in the University of Cambridge who are at the faculty level, then the place to go is science. You want to go to the science departments more than the humanities. I'm not saying there are no Christians in the humanities, but simply in terms of numbers, it's much easier to find Christians in the sciences. And it's quite an interesting characteristic. I've noticed that also in Oxford and Durham and Edinburgh and some other, well, the more historical universities around in my own country. I have no idea about here, but I know it's also the case in some countries, other countries of the world. And I think the fact is that if you look around, if you really thought that science had killed God, then your expectation would be, that Christians, you just wouldn't find Christians in the scientific community. But in fact, certainly in my experience, there are plenty of Christians around. It's the scientific community in a general way will tend to reflect culturally the country in which it's located. So I would say in general, the scientific community in my own country is pretty secular, simply because I live in a very secular country right now. But on the other hand, there are plenty of Christians around right there in the scientific community. And I thought it would be just interesting to finish with one of them who's already been mentioned in the introduction this evening. That's Francis Collins, a good friend of mine. Francis Collins was the director of the Human Genome Project, that great project to sequence DNA, which now costs about $3 billion to do the first time round. And now you can do it, it costs $100 in 20 minutes. It's just really amazing. You can sequence the human genome so rapidly. But Francis Collins then became the director of the National Institutes of Health, which is this huge, probably the biggest research institute in the world, based in Washington, D.C., with a massive budget. And then he stepped down from that a couple of years ago and became a science advisor to the president of the USA, which he's still doing actually during this transitional period. And he was an atheist. He became a Christian in his late 20s. Very interesting story written in this book, The Language of God. If you haven't read that book, that's a great book to read actually. And he's very public about his Christian faith. And if you go around and talk to American scientists who are quite secular, they will have a chat with them, and they'll go on to say, but I know that it's quite normal to be a Christian and a scientist because of Francis Collins, because everybody knows this guy is really a public Christian. So I just want to finish these few comments by something that Francis Collins wrote recently. He says, I think there's a common assumption that you cannot both be a rigorous show-me-the-data scientist and a person who believes in a personal God. I would like to say that from my perspective, that assumption is incorrect. That in fact these two areas are entirely compatible and not only can exist within the same person, but can exist in a very synthetic way and not in a compartmentalized way. I have no reason to see a discordance between what I know as a scientist who spends all day studying the genome of humans and what I believe is somebody who pays a lot of attention to what the Bible has taught me about God and about Jesus Christ. And those are entirely compatible views. close quote. And that really is my view precisely. So I want to thank you for your attention today. I want to invite you to Cambridge. We don't just do punting, although it looks like it from that picture. But if you want to study science and religion for one semester or maybe a whole academic year in beautiful surroundings in Cambridge, you're welcome to come. We have places for you there. And I just want to flag up, before we go into discussion time, this book which has just been published literally a few days ago. We did a book launch for this book just a couple of nights ago here in Pretoria, called Coming to Faith Through Dawkins. And you might think that's a slightly odd title, but and I haven't written anything in the book at all, apart from the preface, but I co-edited this book with someone called Alistair McGrath from the University of Oxford. And this is a book of 12 essays written by 12 different people from 5 different countries, from Australia, South Africa, here in Pretoria. In fact, 3 of our authors from Pretoria, from Egypt, from the United Kingdom and the USA. And these are accounts by people who used to be atheists or agnostics, and then they started reading or getting involved in the writings of the so-called new atheists, people like Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, all these sort of people. And it really got them thinking about the big questions of life. And it was really through Dawkins and through these other new atheists that they came to Christian faith, which sounds quite surprising. And we were kind of surprised when we started meeting people like that, but we thought, why don't we get them to write out their stories and put them in a book? So the book has just come out. It's on sale here for only 300 Rand, special introductory price. We've still got books left over from the book launch a couple of nights ago. So please take a look at that book, which is somewhere around at the back there. Thank you for your attention, and now let's have some discussion together. Thank you so much.